Alright, let's talk about a couple of movies that have been streaming lately. Both kind of which fall into the horror column. Uh, yeah. So, one of them seems to be more predominantly a comedy, and the other one doesn't really seem to know what the hell it is. But yeah, they're both kind of under the horror umbrella. So let's start with Day Shift, which is a movie that I wasn't really thinking much about. I knew that Jamie Foxx was in it, that Snoop Dogg was in it, and that it was like a vampire movie, and that was about it. I saw like one still image of them from it. And I was like, alright, I'll see that eventually, because that's how I treat most Netflix movies. It's like, if I hear decent word, then maybe I'll look into it. I don't know. But then Jamie Foxx was out there doing his job very well. Because he went on Kimmel while it was being guest hosted by David Alan Grier. And of course, I watched that interview just to see them reunite because of In Living Color. And of course, Fox was promoting this. And to be completely honest with you, I'm aware of, the way marketing works and how a big part of an actor's job is to go out there and just kind of plug the movie and then move on. But Jamie Foxx was just really selling the shit out of this movie. He seemed really passionate about it and was really excited about it. So that he was talking about how the director J.J. Perry is what he called a stunt guru, basically, and it's like all the really big stunts you've seen in all the really big movies, from John Wick to Fast and Furious movies to whatever, probably involved this guy, and that's what he was bringing to the table. So yeah, so that alone was like, okay, I'll see what this is about, because usually you can tell when somebody is promoting something but they're not completely passionate about it. But he seemed all in on this movie, so I think he's also a credited producer, so that might help, but that might also be pushing him a little bit. But yeah, he was selling it, so I turned it on, and it starts with quite an opening scene where we get a very stylized action scene, but also in ways that you may not expect from an action movie, especially after something like The Gray Man. You expect to see a lot of really chopped up shit and a lot of stuff that's like barely choreographed, that's being hidden by editing and stuff like that. And the action scenes are not like that. You can kind of tell this was mainly put together by a massive stunt coordinator, and they utilize these different things, like the way the vampires can contort is very unique to stuff like this. The way it utilizes a mirror is very interesting. The way Fox's character utilizes a wire is very interesting. And all of this is packed into this opening scene and gives us this really big punch to start with. And yeah, so it was like, okay, let's see where this goes. So of course there are other aspects, other aspects of plot that are unraveled. There is the whole idea that he is motivated by having daughter problems, where he and his wife are separated, and he and his ex-wife and his daughter might move away, so he's got to come up with money to do that. And it's like, I mean, we've seen this old thing before, whatever. But they put just enough charm into it, in this relationship between him and his daughter, that it's like, oh, okay, even though we've seen this shit over and over again, all right, this is good. This is a good way to set the objective. This is a good way to set up his motivation. So that's great. But we're also introduced to a villain, and not a very strong villain. It's the It feels like this villain's barely here, and when they are there, it's the sort of same old, oh, look how evil and cool I am, and stuff like that. I don't know who this actress is. I even looked her up, and I'm still not quite sure. I don't think I've seen her in anything before. And it's one of those cases where I can't tell if it's the character that's awful or if it's the performance that's awful. But I feel like it's kind of both working together here, so it does kind of suck to go into a movie like this and you just don't give a single shit about the villain at all. But that does give the chance for everything else to kind of get highlighted, whether it be supporting characters or the action itself or whatever. There is another major character that's brought into this, who is Dave Franco, who I've mentioned before I'm not the biggest fan of, but he's fine here. It does seem like a part that very much suits him. That's another thing that Jamie Foxx really built up, was that he didn't want to do this movie without Franco in this part. And I can see that. The chemistry is definitely here. It is the typical, unlikely partner thing where they drive around and Jamie Foxx is one type of guy and he's a significantly different type of guy, more by the rules and by the book and stuff like that. Which is that old thing. There's a point in time where he references them as Crockett and Tubbs, and it's like, because Jamie Foxx played Tubbs at one point. Yeah, okay. And as it went on, though, all this stuff that it was like, yeah, whatever, was kind of starting to grow on me. Where it's like, yeah, it's still very cliche. It's stuff we've seen 1,000 times before. But it does matter if you can put at least a little bit of charm into it. That can bring it to life enough to suit the duration of the movie as well as it can. If there is something that's actually holding this movie back, what's really interesting about this is what's holding the movie back is usually something that's like really opening a movie up and making things, even more interesting than they could be. And it's a good way to take stuff like this that seems like we've seen it before, but then expanding on it. And that is that this isn't one of those movies that's surprisingly, unexpectedly, all about world building, where it has like all of its different rules and all of its different setups and certain groups of characters and all everything serves like a different purpose in the world that this movie is set up, and it seems to kind of be expanding on that. But the problem here is that number one, a lot of the movie is everybody having to just stop and explain things so that they can really build up the details of the world. And it's like, oh, that's what this thing means in this world and all that. And this is why we have to do this, or why this happens like this, or whatever. And it's a lot of explaining a lot of the time, like from beginning to end, which can get very tiresome. And then there's also just the idea, and forgive me because apparently this isn't a very popular opinion that I have, but there's just a lot of the time, I just don't give a shit about world building. Especially if it's a movie that doesn't really feel like it's meant to be this really gigantic, franchise sort of thing. They can hope that it's going to be that, but it doesn't really have that feel. It doesn't have the big feel like Bright comes to mind, the David Ayer movie with Will Smith and Joel Edgerton, where so much of that movie was world building, and it's like, and they focus so much on that the story itself feels so paper thin and almost pointless, and it's like that's where it kind of sucks. And honestly, I never really cared that much about the world building in John Wick. I kind of get that vibe also, where it's like the more there's like I felt like John Wick was at its best when it was so simple. When Alfie Allen had killed the dog, so he wanted to kill everybody involved, and get his car back, all that stuff. But then it's like, but they set up this whole thing in this whole world, and it's like I just get less and less interested the more they're packing onto it. And I think because that doesn't work for me with stuff like John Wick or Bright is all it really does is make everything feel really overstuffed, and it's just like, and it's also this idea of it being a thing that sets up franchises. It's that thing, that age-old thing now, where it doesn't really feel like a complete story. It just feels like setting things up a lot is what it's really devoted to, and it's stuff like that's just kind of old to me, and I honestly never really cared that much about it, unless we're talking like Lord of the Rings or something. That's obviously a whole other thing, but stuff like this, I just never really cared about a world building aspect and didn't really feel like it was that necessary, but that's how they're telling the story. So, like I was saying though, the action is very well choreographed. I think the main problem here also is that pretty much all of the gore, it didn't look like any of the gore was physically there. It feels like all of the gore, every single little drop of blood is CGI. And obviously every single decapitation is going to be CGI and all that. So when you're combining these things where it's like everything's nicely choreographed, but then while they're fighting, they're pretty much constantly killing vampires while they fight. So while you can say, oh, that's a really executed move, it's immediately followed by just the fakest looking CGI when the kill happens. So it's like it's really hard to take in like, oh, this is good because it's clearly a real stunt and, something really happening. And then this is definitely something that's just not even on the set at all. It was clearly done in post-production. And it's like combining these two things kind of really takes away the magic of how well it's choreographed and how great the stunt work is. And it just kind of softened the impact and everything. So it's like it felt admirable and artificial at the same time every time an action scene was happening. So that was trying to find the balance where it's like, oh, I can really, really appreciate that thing, though. and you try to kind of take that away from the scene most of all, because that's the thing that the most effort was put into. But there's a lot of CGI, and you can every single time it shows up, you can tell. So it's like, was it too hard to get just even a little bit in regards to like practical effects? Just even one drop of blood, just really there. But I think it's all CGI every single time we see something gory. So there's that. There is a car chase that is very fun, especially the way they sort of combine it in the scene with a video game simultaneously. But it is also very drone heavy. Something else we just saw in The Gray Man, which it's almost like it's going to be a Netflix trademark or something, was have a scene that's supposed to be exciting, so have like, a drone come and fly down, and that's the shot we're getting. Just at the most random times in mid scene or whatever, and it's not really going to enhance a whole lot. It's just made to look busy. But they handle that much better here than in The Gray Man. In The Gray Man, you still can't tell what the hell's going on in any of the action scenes, but here the car chase is a very fun scene, but much like the regular fight scenes, you can see where the fake stuff is, and it's like kind of, oh, I really appreciate when you're doing the real stuff, but you're also really distracting with all the fake stuff too, and it's like, just, really focus on the stuff that you can do, and try to expand on that as much as you can, but, that's how it works. As far as this also being, where I talked about how seems like it's just as much of a comedy, if not more so than anything else, than an action movie or a horror movie. I don't really think I was laughing a lot. What's really interesting is you would expect a movie this over the top, that the scenes that are meant to be big laughs would be also over the top. But the funniest moments in this movie by far are just when Jamie Foxx just has like a line delivery here and there, and just the way he'll say something in whatever moment has just happened. It can be really funny, especially moments where he's like, there's a lot of moments where he has to kind of explain himself, like how he got into a situation, and he just, after we've seen him as like this badass fighter, when he has to explain himself, he just seems so lost. But it seems like that's what makes it funny. So that was working for me, and there was one line that just killed me, and he just delivered it like it was nothing, like it was just a throwaway line, and I just found it funny as hell. It's without saying too much, another character has just woken up, and they've been tortured, and they're bloody, and they're just all around fucked up. And when they wake up, they say, "What happened to me?" And Jamie Foxx says, "Just some bullshit." Like, he's trying to get past it as much as possible, so that's his delivery, it's just some bullshit. And that's just so funny to me, the way he said that, and given the context of the scene. So that's where I thought a lot of the comedy was, so I was able to appreciate that. As far as other characters that really haven't been mentioned, it's usually, there's a lot of characters, but they just have a tendency to kind of come and go, and most of them are allies. And there's one particular ally that's very crucial to the movie and the climax, that's introduced very late. And when their introduction does happen, it's almost like an hour into the movie, and it seems like we've taken a complete detour in a complete different mood altogether. And it's like, okay, well, that was significant for some reason. And so stuff like that's kind of glaring as far as getting us in the direction we're going, especially since it's happening so late. And like I said, there's so many other allies that are introduced that are just come and go. And because of this, because we have so many of these allies and so many of these characters, all of this ends up resulting in Snoop Dogg getting underutilized, which is a big problem, because this is a character, and just Snoop Dogg in general, and the presence that he brings to this movie is something that kind of deserves more screen time. And it's like, because a lot of the times when you see Snoop Dogg just pop up in a movie, you think it's like that's the joke, like we're supposed to laugh because Snoop Dogg is here. But like, let's not forget, Snoop Dogg's been acting in movies for like over 20 years now. So he's got something. He's got like a presence when he's actually on screen, and he can play characters. He may seem like he's constantly Snoop Dogg, sure. It's kind of hard to argue against that, but still, he's got something, and I would have liked to have seen more of him here than there is. But I said that's just another problem, is I think there's just too many fucking characters in it. And the script apparently thought so too, because they get rid of them as soon as possible. But yeah, so it sounds like I'm complaining about it a lot, but by the time we got to the end and the climax was happening, it did feel like there were more times I was liking it than times that I wasn't. And even then, there weren't really times that I was, like, hating it. There were times where I was like, I don't know that I'm into this or that I'm gonna get into this. But then it would, like, it would get better as it went, and characters would get more likable and more intriguing as they went, except, like the villain or people that never showed up again after one time. But, yeah, it's fine, and it's, a good enough time. It's definitely better than I would expect from, just Netflix in general. Netflix and world building movies, because the last time we put together Jamie Foxx, Netflix, and world building movie, we got Project Power, which is a movie that I barely. We talked about it on here, but I don't really remember anything. And this might be. This is probably more memorable than that, but I could also see this fading if I don't, like, see it again anytime soon. But it's still fine, as it goes. Like, I never, like, hated it or anything, and it never, like, I never completely turned on it or anything, which, like I said, you kind of set the bar low when you have a movie like this that's on Netflix, and it's fine, I guess. So, there's that. It does its job, more or less. So, let's now go on to They/Them, which I only learned recently is how you say the title. And it makes perfect sense. It's a really good title. However, when you go into a movie like this, and you see the Blumhouse name on it, and that title, you think, oh, this is going to be something kind of tongue in cheek. It's going to be something kind of fun about the slasher genre and kind of saying something or whatever. Maybe satirical stuff like that. But it kind of sets its tone pretty early, and it's a really serious one, which is odd. Also, the craziest and weirdest thing about this movie has to be, without a doubt, the fact that it is not only written by, but it is the directorial debut of John Logan, who I sometimes confuse with Peter Morgan. I have to make sure I don't do that. John Logan is the three-time Oscar nominee who has written stuff like Gladiator and The Aviator and Hugo and more. He's done Skyfall. Yeah, he's the writer and director of this, and this is what he chose as his directorial debut. It's very bizarre. Very, very weird. So, and obviously, I talked about the title and it having a weirdly serious tone, but another thing is the fact that Kevin Bacon is essentially the star of this movie. I wouldn't call him the main character, but he's like the star. He's the face of the movie. And, of course, that's an in-joke in itself because of Friday the 13th. And he's back at a camp, and it's supposedly a slasher movie. And, now Kevin Bacon is in a much more sort of authoritative place, and a sort of threatening place for our main characters here. But the thing about it is there's a lot of threats going on in here. There's a lot of threatening characters and situations, because obviously it is about a gay conversion camp, but in the setting of a horror movie, which, not really much difference. But, that's... I feel like there's so much you could do here, and it's something that you could do to where you could keep up, and you could keep it up being like, a satire, where it's like it's sort of this send up of what it's doing, but it would also have something really allegorical to say about it, like kind of on the side, and it would be able to kind of slip in, really clever things in here that like add a base to what's going on here, to where it's like, oh, it kind of looks like this thing, but underneath it's like, oh, but it's a really interesting way to say this kind of thing. And I would say you'd pretty much assume that's what the movie's gonna be, right? That's what it has to be, especially from a three-time Oscar-nominated screenwriter. It's gotta be more than the surface, right? Surely. Well, I didn't really get anything else. But here's the thing, though, is that it is trying to be a lot of things, it seems. And it really can't quite seem to pick which one it wants to be. And I think the fact that it doesn't really do any of the things that it does to a high level is where this kind of fails. It's trying to do a whole lot of things, but it never really reaches the mark on any of them. Because first off, it starts off, and it seems unique enough. It seems interesting enough because we do have a generic opening scene where somebody gets killed, whatever. But then we have all the campers showing up, and of course they're here and they're like, our parents sent us here, and they're gonna disown us or something if we don't come. But if we do this, then we get rewarded. We get to emancipate ourselves or whatever else. And then it's like, okay, but then we introduce Kevin Bacon, who is the leader of this camp, and you think, oh, this is going to be our big villain. He's going to be really scary. He's going to be really intimidating. And he comes out and he's charming, normal Kevin Bacon, and he's all the characters are surprised. People are like, it's almost like they're thinking, like, are we even in the right place? Because he's like, I understand, where you're coming from. I understand, and I don't have any hate towards anybody. I don't, I'm not against anything that you feel, or anything like that, or who you are, or anything like that. This is just, we're just gonna do this, and we're gonna see what happens. And if you're the same at the end, then more power to you. And it's like, okay, that's not what I expected from this setup, and not what the characters expected from this setup. Okay. And it's to the point where there is a little bit something ominous, because you immediately think, it's too good to be true. Obviously, this is going to go... There's a very, very dark something going on here, obviously. But Bacon is very convincing in this opening scene of, you guys are going to be fine, and, you're not going to be made to do anything that you don't want to do. We're just trying stuff out, is essentially what he's saying. And, however, the reason I set that up so much is because you would think, when you're going to unveil, oh, there actually is definitely something wrong here, obviously, that it's going to be very gradual. It's going to be throughout the movie. Almost Midsummer-like, maybe? The way it gradually reveals itself in its sinister nature as it goes, and what's underneath starts to come up. But no, like, the next scene with Kevin Bacon, he's clearly off, and he's a completely different character. And he's a villain for the rest of the movie. He's like a clear villain for the rest of the movie. So, I don't really know what that whole setup was for. To build it up like, oh yeah, everything's gonna be fine here. We're not gonna hate you for who you are or anything like that. And if it doesn't work, then whatever. That's just gone after that first scene. Then the rest of it is, oh, everything is sinister. There was no gradual anything whatsoever. So, and that's the thing too, is that when you talk about the tone, because obviously, because of what this place is and what they do, which is obvious from the start, everybody knows going in what this kind of place is, you would think there'd be, like, the best kind of horror is when it's not being horror directly to your face, but there's something underlying constantly, even in mundane moments, where it's like, even if everything seems fine, the best horror can still kind of get you, like, even though everything feels fine right now, there's an uneasiness in you, like, but I just sense something is off here. But it's not seemingly trying to do that, because when we're getting to know the characters, and we're getting their stories and all that, and then we see them interacting, that's basically an entire hour of the movie with, like, barely any horror tones whatsoever. Like, hardly any feeling of what's off here. Like, whenever it goes into something where it's like, take for instance when they start having, like, sexual encounters. It's like, there's a number of ways you can take this. There's the idea that, like, oh, there's something clearly off, or it's like, oh, that means sex equals death in movies like this. And so there's always that kind of feeling. Or, you can also say, if this is going to be a satire of this material, then the sexual encounters could be something like, clearly tongue-in-cheek. Like, after a while, in slasher movies, you could tell that whoever was making them clearly had it in their minds that people are going to know sex equals death in these kind of movies. So it's like, you can do it tongue-in-cheek, or you can do it with an actual sinister undertone and make the audience feel uneasy or whatever. And it's none of those things. Anytime any of this is happening, it is played completely seriously. There's like a romanticism in the scenes with no other tones coming in, no other genres, creeping in at all. It just decides to be, like a romance movie at one point, or you can almost even say an erotic drama at some point. And there's just no signs whatsoever that this is a horror movie, or a slasher movie at that. And I know that I've said plenty of times before that one of the strengths of slasher movies that a lot of people don't seem to pay attention to is how much time they take to build up their characters. Even like the most, off the radar slasher movie that's literally just a blood and guts movie. Usually those movies still take time. They still have like a good half-hour chunk of time where we're just watching the characters interact and just do whatever. But you still get the sense that we're headed towards something. Here, I never really knew where we were going, and usually that would be a good thing. But here, it's like we do know we're eventually going to be some kind of slasher movie, but there's still times where I feel lost. Like, is the movie ever going to come to this point, or any point? And I don't know, because there's a point, because, okay, you talk about seeing the characters interact, and it's like, oh, they're, pranking each other, or just fucking around, or whatever, and introducing different types, all that, different personalities, whatever. No matter how short-lived they'll be, it sets them up as people. In this movie, we get what I can only really describe as a nearly full-on musical number. That feels really weirdly out of place, as you can probably imagine. And I don't even think, like, that might almost sound like that almost might sound like an exaggeration to say, oh, it's practically a musical number, but not really. That's pretty much what it is. They break into song, they break into dance in the cabin or whatever, and that's a whole scene. And yeah, and after that we get one shot of Kevin Bacon looking like, I don't know what his expression is, to be honest with you. Kevin Bacon's obviously a legendary actor that can do so much and say so much. I gotta be totally honest with you. No idea what the fuck this character was thinking when we got this shot to him. I mean, is he angry? Is he plotting? I don't know. But that's the thing, is usually movies like this, the unknown might be a little creepy, right? But, no. It's just, what is this movie? Like, what is it trying to be? What am I supposed to think it is? It's a big mystery, and not in the way that a slasher movie should be. Especially in the sense that it was about... I can't even remember exactly what the tip-off was, but this is one of those ways where you can figure out early who the masked killer is. And I said, I don't even remember what exactly made me say, I'm pretty sure it's that person, and it is that person. But it felt obvious in a way. Maybe subconsciously obvious, I don't know, but I feel like a lot of people are going to figure it out, so long before it happens. So there's that. So talking about this masked killer that has the mask itself and the just the presence in general of the slasher in costume has got to be 60 seconds, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, somewhere in that vicinity. It's a long... That we open with a kill, then it's a long time, and then we get one kill, and then it's a long time, and we're basically at the climax. And you might think, oh, it's a slasher movie with not a lot of kills in it. So that there must be some interesting things in between. It must be more of a character thing, or I said even an allegorical thing or something. No. It's just whenever the slasher shows up, it feels like we switched to a different movie, completely at random. So it just feels totally random. So when it comes together and all is revealed, it kind of makes sense, but at the same time, it's like, in that case, the movie's way too long. It's like an hour 40 something, and it's got about, maybe barely an hour of material. Even at this point, it's sometimes when, slash movies run out of material, you get about 20 minutes of a climax. It's just the final girl running around in the dark, and then they fight. But it doesn't go in that direction. And it's one of those cases where I almost want to commend it for not going in some obvious directions, but at the same time, it's just so confused at what it wants to be. It's so clear, like, it did not feel like it had a destination in mind from when it started to where it got to. There's good moments here and there. There's a whole, extended scene that's set on a shooting range that I thought was pretty good. but once again, feels like it's from an entirely different movie from the musical number and the slasher movie. And so it's I don't know. There is a good movie in here, but there's like so much that you'd have to take out. And you can tell right away too. You can tell that all of these different pieces just are not being put together. They're not fitting. So that's yeah. So and it's not even really a full on horror movie until the last 20 minutes. So that like in another like I was saying, the last 20 minutes of any other slasher movie is the climax itself. But when there's only 20 minutes left of this hour and 40 something minute movie is when it's like, oh yeah, we were gonna do that horror thing. Let's go ahead and do that horror thing, and then we'll roll the credits. I don't know. I don't know what the hell this is. Like I said, I think John Logan's involvement is probably the most confusing thing about it. So I don't know. I really have no idea what this is. So let's go ahead and leave this at that. So the next thing we're going to go to is into theatrical release movies with Vengeance and Mac and Rita and Fall, which are quite varying degrees of quality, which we'll talk about right after this. So then after that, the usual weekend stuff and more reviews, Bodies, 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 and Beast will be happening as well. So and more stuff, 13 Lives, a lot of stuff. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.